Under the summer sky of Utah in 1979, where the Wasatch Mountains stood silent like mute witnesses, a tragedy so small it could easily be overlooked, but so horrific that no one could sleep peacefully began. The midday sun shone down on the small wooden house in Provo as Maggie Linton returned, only to find the crib empty and a chilling void running down her spine. "Nora?" The mother's soft call was immediately swallowed by the deadly silence. In the next few minutes, the air suddenly thickened, as if the entire house was keeping its own secret. Police swarmed in, their blue and red lights flashing on the walls, canine units sniffing around the yard, and the young babysitter, the woman entrusted with the family's faith, trembling as she gave her first statement. What started as a seemingly simple disappearance quickly turned into an obsession lasting nearly half a century. Tiny traces like dried milk stains, a pink fabric scrap, a dent on a toy car, or the loose soil behind the house, gradually revealed a story no one wanted to believe, but no one could deny. As months and years passed, conflicting statements, buried secrets, hidden evidence, and the terrifying silence of the adults in that house created an inescapable maze, deeply dividing the entire community. And then, decades later, when silver hair replaced seemingly lost memories, a confession tape, a lidar model, and a speck of DNA too small for the naked eye, brought America back to a case they thought they'd forgotten. This is not just the story of a child's death, this is the story of silence, cover-ups, fear, and how justice buried in the ground for 46 years still finds its way to surface through every grain of dust, every fiber of fabric, every belated confession. Are you ready to go back to the summer of 1979, the summer when all of Utah was haunted by Nora Linton's final cry? Sit down, take a deep breath. This story will not only make you question crime, but also faith, community, and the truth that persistently waits to return to the light. Before diving deep into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love these journeys to forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The summer of 1979, the town of Provo, Utah lay still under the stifling heat, the air thick with the scent of dry pine and sun-scorched grass. In the small wooden house on the edge of town, Maggie Linton, a 24-year-old secretary, prepared for her morning shift. She picked up Nora, her 2-month-old daughter, and placed her in the crib by the window, where the early sunlight cast a pale golden streak. Helen Shepherd, the 26-year-old babysitter Maggie had hired just a few weeks ago through the church bulletin board, had arrived early. She took the baby with a gentleness that seemed trustworthy, then bent down to adjust the pink blanket and the stuffed bear next to the old red toy car. Everything proceeded normally, so quietly that Maggie could only hear the ticking clock and Nora's tiny breaths. Maggie locked the door, stepped out into the yard, feeling the familiar reassurance of leaving her child with the babysitter and heading to work as usual. By noon, Maggie returned earlier than planned due to a fleeting headache. She opened the front door and found the air in the house unusually cold. The standing fan was still whirring, but there were no baby sounds or Helen's chatter as usual. She called Helen, no one answered. Hurrying to the bedroom, Maggie saw the crib empty, the pink blanket draped crookedly over the edge, the milk bottle lying on the floor as if hastily dropped. The toy car was out of place, the stuffed bear gone. Maggie frantically called her daughter's name, rushing through the living room, kitchen, bathroom. She opened the back door, scanned the yard, but saw no one. What made Maggie even more panicked was that not only was Nora missing, Helen was nowhere in the house either. There were no signs of struggle, no note left behind. Just a strange emptiness enveloping the house that was usually filled with a baby's cries every morning. Maggie's hands trembled violently as she dialed the landline. Her voice broke with fear as she told the operator her daughter was gone, and the babysitter was missing too. The sound of police sirens echoed from the end of the red dirt road just minutes after Maggie's call. 2 officers entered, noting the house almost intact, except for the empty crib, the pink blanket askew, and the dropped bottle. Maggie, still in shock, tried to recount returning home and not finding either Nora or Helen. One officer immediately called for backup and K-9 units to the scene. The house was cordoned off with yellow tape. Neighbors began gathering, anxious to inquire. K-9 units were brought to the backyard, sniffing every corner of the garden, but finding no clear traces. Police checked the shed, fences, and the empty lot behind. No baby cries, no signs of someone fleeing, or a strange car stopping. Everything seemed too quiet to explain how a 2-month-old could disappear from the house without anyone knowing. Officers successively collected initial signs in the bedroom: curtains, dusted with dirt, as if yanked or hastily opened, a trail of coagulated milk on the wooden floor, leading from the crib toward the door, and small handprints on the wall, unclear when made. These details weren't enough to conclude anything, but they made the police feel something unusual had happened. Meanwhile, Maggie was asked to recount everything from the morning. She insisted she had placed Nora in the car seat, preparing her to sleep after feeding. However, when police found and brought Helen back from the Eastern Road, where she said she went looking for the baby, Helen claimed Maggie had placed Nora in the crib before leaving. The contradiction between the two accounts immediately caught the police's attention, as where the baby was placed could be key to determining what happened during Maggie's absence. Helen explained leaving the house as panic when not seeing Nora, but the officers noted that the babysitter leaving the scene right at the time of the disappearance was unusual behavior. One officer separated Helen and questioned her multiple times, but her answers were inconsistent about timing, the baby's location, and what she did before leaving. The search team expanded to the alleys around the neighborhood. Provo residents quickly joined, some with flashlights, others with sticks to part the grass, even families bringing their kids to help search. In the empty lots, they called Nora's name, hoping however slim that she was just lying somewhere in the shade. Police knocked on every nearby door. Some neighbors said they saw nothing unusual. An elderly woman vaguely remembered hearing a light thud, but didn't know when. All this vague information made reconstructing the events even harder. Technical officers noted a few more signs: a drag mark of dirt on the back doorstep, deep adult shoe prints in the flower bed, and a few small child footprints, possibly from other kids. Helen had watched before. What troubled the police was no signs of forced entry or external intrusion, forcing them to consider the possibility that someone inside carried Nora away without leaving clear traces. As the search stretched into the afternoon, a temporary command post was set up on the sidewalk. Maggie refused to rest in the police car, standing right on the lawn, eyes never leaving the search team as if blinking would make her lose the chance to find her child. Helen held back for further statements, kept repeating she didn't know what happened, but her nervousness made the police unable to dismiss her. The neighborhood atmosphere grew heavy as the sun tilted toward the Wasatch Mountains. Every small sound startled people. From initial impatience, the community shifted to real panic. How could a child disappear like this in such a peaceful neighborhood? By dusk, after hours of fruitless searching, police officially shifted the case from missing child to serious disappearance. Flashlights were turned on again, sweeping through every bush and patch of ground, but still no sign of Nora. No one knew that the disappointment of that day was just the beginning of a decades-long case, and the secret buried under the soil behind Maggie's house would be uncovered in the following days. Detective Alan Pierce, with over 8 years of experience investigating child-related cases at Provo PD, arrived at the scene late that afternoon. Stepping into Maggie Linton's house, he immediately noted the strange emptiness permeating the space. No baby cries, no footsteps, just the faint hum of the fan and items out of place. The house showed no major disturbance, but an unnatural absence. Pierce asked everyone to leave Nora's bedroom so he could observe closely. Under the strong light of his specialized flashlight, he saw the empty wooden crib with the pink blanket shifted to one side, folds stretched as if grabbed hastily. On the floor, he bent down to pick up the plastic milk bottle. It still had a few drops of coagulated milk. This made him think the bottle was dropped or yanked from someone's hand, not set down normally. Right next to the crib's leg, under a thin layer of dust, he discovered a red metal toy truck, a popular mini pickup from the 1970s for kids. What caught his attention was a clear dent in the truck bed, and chipped red paint revealing gray metal underneath. On the truck's edge, he gently flipped it with gloved hands and saw a few thin white threads clinging to it. Pierce immediately bagged it as evidence. Moving to the wall, he found a long smear running from about 60-70 centimeters height down near the floor. It wasn't deep, but enough for him to note it wasn't from furniture. The smear surface was whitish, possibly chalk or dust from baby clothes. He noted immediately, sign of downward forceful movement. After completing the preliminary notes, Pierce had Helen Shepherd brought to the living room for immediate questioning. Maggie was still in shock and cared for by another officer in the front yard, while Helen sat on the chair with lightly trembling hands. When asked about the morning's events, Helen said baby Nora was sleeping in the crib, and she only left the room for a few minutes to get a towel. She insisted that when she returned, the window was slightly open, and the baby was gone. However, when Pierce probed deeper, when was the baby placed in the crib? Did she cry? Did you hear any noises? Helen started stumbling. She changed from the baby was sleeping peacefully, to the baby was a bit fussy, but I soothed her, and when Pierce asked why the bottle was on the floor, she said, probably I dropped it in panic. These answers contradicted her earlier statements to the initial officer. Pierce then called Dorothy Hale, Helen's mother-in-law, for questioning. Dorothy said that morning, she had been to Helen's house, and saw Nora placed on the big bed, not the crib. When asked again, Helen immediately denied it, saying Dorothy misremembered. However, Dorothy insisted firmly, because she had just adjusted the bedsheet shortly before. Right after, Doreen Parker, Helen's aunt-in-law, also provided a separate statement. She said she and Dorothy were in the front yard weeding and cleaning the old garden, and during that time, Helen was the only one inside with the baby. When asked about noises, Doreen hesitated and said she heard a strange sound, like something falling or hitting the floor hard, but wasn't sure where it came from. The statements from all three women were completely inconsistent with each other. Helen, baby in crib, she only left for a few minutes. Dorothy, baby placed on big bed that morning. Doreen, she and Dorothy were both outside, not in the house as Helen said. Pierce clearly sensed the lack of honesty in the statements, but he couldn't conclude anything based on gut feeling alone. He requested the technical team to fully photograph the scene, take fingerprints around the crib, and check the window for signs of external opening. However, the window frame was completely intact, no pry marks or forced locks. This made him lean more toward the possibility that someone inside was directly involved in Nora's disappearance. When checking the back door, Pierce saw the soil on the step disturbed, but not enough to determine direction of movement. No new baby shoe prints, no tire tracks leaving hastily. Everything seemed to indicate that if Nora was carried out, it was done very carefully, or in a very short time. Late afternoon, with the outdoor search still yielding no results, Pierce returned to stand in the middle of Nora's small room. He looked again at the crib, the dented toy car, the wall smear, and the thin white threads on the truck edge. In the silence, the room seemed to be trying to tell him something. Something had happened here, but the only people present that morning were hiding the most important part of the story. Pierce jotted in his notebook a short line, but full of a seasoned investigator's intuition. There is a cover-up in this house. On the third day since Nora went missing, the small neighborhood in Provo could no longer maintain its usual tranquility. Police, volunteers, and the search team had combed through nearly the entire area around Maggie's house, but there was no sign that Nora had been taken out of the residential area. Detective Alan Pierce, based on the irregularities inside the house, paid particular attention to the backyard, where he sensed something that didn't align with a typical missing person case. The backyard was just a sparse patch of grass, a few low bushes, and an old wooden fence. However, upon closer inspection, Pierce noticed that a section of ground in the northwest corner was lighter in color than the surrounding area, as if it had been recently disturbed. The sign was subtle, but enough to prompt him to direct the search team to focus on this spot. K9 units were brought in, and immediately reacted strongly at the exact location Pierce suspected. The dog barked continuously, sniffing close to the ground, signaling that something was below. A young officer used a soil probe to check the softness of the earth. The probe sank in unusually easily, unlike naturally compacted soil over time. Recognizing the situation, Pierce immediately ordered a small perimeter sealed off around the area, preventing residents from approaching to preserve the scene. The digging was done by hand in the initial phase to avoid damaging any evidence. Only after a few thin layers of soil did a piece of pale pink fabric emerge. Everyone stopped immediately. Pierce knelt down, gently brushing off the remaining dirt clinging to the fabric. It was the pink of the blanket Maggie still used to wrap Nora. Digging another few inches deeper, the entire blanket became visible, and inside was baby Nora's body. A heavy silence enveloped the entire backyard. Though everyone knew the possibility was high, the moment of confronting the truth still caused many to turn away. Next to the blanket was the small stuffed bear that Maggie said she always placed beside the baby each morning. It was mud-soaked, distorted from being pressed under the soil. At the edge of the hole were fresh shovel marks, sharp and neat cuts, indicating that the digging of the hole had been done hastily, near the time Nora disappeared. The investigative team documented every detail. The burial depth was only about a little over 1 foot, too shallow for long-term concealment behavior. The positions of the objects, the condition of the soil, the disturbed soil layers, all of it pointed to this not being a place where someone intended to hide the body forever, but rather the actions of a panicked person, doing everything in a very short time. Pierce stepped back a few paces, looking up at the house. From the back door to the burial spot was only a few footsteps. If Nora had been carried out here, the person who did so must have been very familiar with the area, and not worried about being detected while moving. This weakened the suspicion of a stranger breaking in, and increased the likelihood that someone inside the house was directly involved. As Nora's body was lifted from the ground, and placed into the body bag, Maggie, though held back by an officer at a distance to avoid witnessing it, still burst into sobs upon hearing the news. Helen, who was sitting in the living room when the police announced it, appeared stunned, but her reaction wasn't clear enough for Pierce to determine if it was genuine shock or defensiveness. With the body found right in the backyard, the investigation immediately shifted direction. No longer a missing person case, but an unnatural death with signs of body concealment, and most importantly, the shallow grave indicated intentional behavior, rather than a chain of accidents. Pierce requested the forensics team to re-examine the back door, the kitchen area, and the hallway leading to the yard. There were no signs of forced entry, the door was intact. This further reinforced the possibility that the person who took Nora to the yard was someone with access to the house. Small footprints near the back door step, and deep adult shoe impressions in the flower bed, were also carefully recorded. As night began to fall, and the scene lights were turned on, Pierce stood looking at the shallow hole that had been dug up, the pink blanket still dusted with dirt, and the once peaceful yard, now shrouded in a somber atmosphere. He thought of the dent on the toy car, the skid mark on the wall, the conflicting statements from the 3 women, all beginning to connect in a terrifying way. Before leaving the scene, Pierce noted in the case log a crucial line, the words marking a major turning point in the case: death confirmed. Homicide investigation. High likelihood the perpetrator is among those present in the house on the morning the baby went missing. And from this moment, the investigation officially entered a completely new chapter. Baby Nora's body was transported to the University of Utah Hospital's morgue that same night. The cold, bright space of the examination room made the atmosphere even more silent. Dr. Henry Calloway, the seasoned forensic pathologist, opened the file, glanced at the victim's age of just 2 months, and prepared to begin the procedure. Cases involving infants were always the type that required his utmost caution. During the external body examination, Calloway quickly noticed an abnormality in the head area. Nora's skull showed slight depressions at 2 symmetrical positions. X-rays provided clear results, 2 parallel fractures running horizontally. For an infant, this type of injury didn't match a light fall from an adult's arms or from a crib. It indicated strong impact force from a hard object with an edge, like the corner of a table, the edge of a dresser, or a metal toy. Continuing the body observation, Calloway discovered 2 right-side rib fractures. Infant bones are highly elastic. Breaking them requires strong compressive force or significant impact. There were no signs these were old injuries. They occurred at the same time as the head trauma. He examined the soft tissues. No signs of strangulation, no large bruises on the face or neck, no ligature marks or fingernail scratches. A detailed examination of the lower body showed no signs of assault. This helped determine the case was not sexual assault, but purely strong force trauma. Based on body temperature, rigor mortis, degree of decomposition, and statements about the last time Nora was seen, Calloway estimated the time of death coincided with the period when Maggie left the house, when only Helen was with the baby. This was a very important factor, as it narrowed the time of death to a specific window, just a few hours into the morning, when Nora disappeared. In the preliminary report sent to the police, Calloway clearly noted, death due to blunt force trauma, strong head injury. 2 parallel fractures inconsistent with everyday accidents. Rib fractures due to compressive or crushing force. No signs of pathology or congenital defects that could cause natural death. Upon receiving the report, Detective Alan Pierce felt the pieces beginning to point in the same direction. The clues at the scene, the dent on the toy car, the skid mark on the wall, the dropped bottle, all became more significant under the light of the forensic conclusions. He recalled Helen's statement that the baby was sleeping peacefully in the crib, while Dorothy said that morning, Nora was on the big bed, and Doreen claimed both were out in the yard, leaving Helen alone in the house. The most important question, could this have been an accident? Pierce asked Dr. Calloway directly about it during their exchange at the hospital. Dr. Calloway didn't need long to consider. If fallen from the crib or lightly dropped, there wouldn't be 2 parallel fractures like that. This type of force requires a hard edge and strong impact. Those words clarified the investigation's direction. Not just a disappearance, not just discovering the body. This was very likely abusive behavior, leading to death. Pierce returned to the office to review photos of the red toy car seized from Nora's room. The dent on the car's body had a sharp edge, matching the type of force that caused the 2 parallel fractures Calloway described. He noted the possibility that the toy car was the injury-causing object, though further analysis was still needed. The forensic report also indicated that Nora's body had no widespread bruising or fingernail marks, meaning the perpetrator didn't strangle or shake vigorously for an extended time. This aligned with a single impact mechanism, a strike throw or hard drop onto a solid object. For a 2-month-old infant, such a force was enough to cause near-instant death. As he pieced the details together, Pierce realized it all fit the hypothesis that Nora was injured inside the room, rather than being taken outside and meeting an accident elsewhere. The body found in the backyard only showed an attempt at concealment, not changing the time of death. He added to the case file, time of death falls within the period Helen was alone. Type of injury matches hard object in Nora's room. Shallow burial indicates hasty action. Need to re-interview Helen, Dorothy and Doreen with focus on time leaving the room and sounds heard. Pierce knew he still didn't have enough direct evidence to charge anyone, but the forensic report had turned the case from a mystery into a suspected murder. From here, every next step he took would no longer be searching for a lost child, but clarifying who caused Nora's death, and who was trying to cover up the truth inside that peaceful house. Immediately after receiving the forensic report, concluding Nora's death was due to strong head trauma. Detective Alan Pierce returned to the Provo police station for official interrogations of the 3 women present in the house on the morning of the incident: Helen Shepherd, Dorothy Hale, and Doreen Parker. The forensic results, 2 parallel skull fractures, broken ribs, and time of death, coinciding with when Maggie was out, made each woman's statement particularly crucial. Helen was called in first. She appeared tired, with red eyes but not truly showing signs of someone who had cried extensively. When Pierce asked her to recount the entire sequence of events, Helen repeated her initial story. Nora was sleeping in the crib. She only left the room for a moment to get a cloth, and when she returned, the baby was gone. However, when Pierce probed deeper about the bottle on the floor, the dirt-stuck curtain, and the noise the neighbors heard, Helen began to falter. She said, "Maybe I dropped it, maybe the wind blew hard, or I don't remember clearly." When Pierce shared the preliminary forensic conclusion that Nora died from strong impact force, inconsistent with an accident, Helen froze, but still insisted she didn't do anything to harm the baby. What caught Pierce's attention was the inconsistency in her tone, assertive at times, evasive at others, then claiming not to remember. Especially, she couldn't provide an exact timeline for leaving the room. After Helen, Dorothy was brought in. Dorothy recounted the morning with more certainty in her voice. She said when she entered the bedroom, she saw Nora on the big bed, not in the crib as Helen described. She said she straightened the bed blanket, then went out to the backyard to pull weeds with Doreen. She didn't hear intense crying, but possibly heard something falling to the floor, though unsure of the timing. Dorothy also affirmed she didn't see Helen doing anything unusual, but her account clearly contradicted Helen's about the baby's position and who was in the house. Doreen was brought in last, as the oldest and with less sharp memory, but she still clearly remembered that both she and Dorothy were outside in the yard when Nora went missing. When asked about sounds, she confirmed hearing a loud noise from inside, but thought it was just bumping into furniture. She didn't enter the house until she heard Helen calling Nora's name. These statements only heightened Pierce's suspicions. Helen said Dorothy and Doreen were in the living room. Dorothy and Doreen affirmed they were outside in the yard the entire time Maggie was gone. Helen said Nora was in the crib. Dorothy said Nora was on the big bed. Only Doreen heard the loud noise, consistent with the forensic conclusion. These contradictions weren't minor, but at the most critical points: Nora's position, and who was in the house at the time of the injury. Pierce returned to the interrogation room for a second round with Helen. He didn't reveal the full forensic report, but clearly stated that Nora's death was not an accident. Under that pressure, Helen offered a new explanation. "Maybe when I picked up the baby, her head hit something but I don't remember." This was a vague answer, and didn't match the strong trauma type Nora suffered. Helen's hit something couldn't explain the 2 parallel fractures, or the broken ribs. Pierce asked more directly, if Helen only left the room for a few minutes, why was the bottle on the floor? Why was the curtain stuck with dirt? Why was the toy shifted? Why did she leave the house before the police arrived, instead of staying to search? Helen only replied that she was too panicked, a reason Pierce found unconvincing. Based on these contradictions and the forensic evidence, the police decided to detain Helen Shepherd for further investigation. Although there was no direct evidence proving she caused the injuries, she was the last person with Nora during the time frame of the death. Dorothy and Doreen were released home, but required to be available for additional statements at any time. As Helen was led down the hallway to the holding cell, Pierce stood at the interrogation room door, observing through the frosted glass. He knew the investigation still had many unresolved matters, but one thing was certain: Nora's death wasn't random, and the truth was being deliberately concealed by someone. Starting from this moment, the case was officially classified as suspected homicide, and Helen Shepherd, the trusted babysitter, became the focal point of an investigation, increasingly surrounded by unfavorable evidence. After being held overnight, Helen Shepherd began showing signs of exhaustion and wavering confidence in her initial statements. In the next round of interrogation, Detective Alan Pierce decided to exploit that instability. He started by asking Helen to recount the entire morning again, this time emphasizing every little detail she had repeatedly glossed over. Helen tried to stay calm, but her voice was no longer as steady as it had been in the early days. After a few minutes of silence and hesitation, Helen suddenly said there was something she feared being misunderstood about, so she hadn't mentioned it. She confessed that when she picked up Nora from the bed to place her in the crib, she had tripped over her son's red toy truck, the very one Pierce had found in the room during the initial search. "I slipped and the baby fell to the floor," Helen said, trying to emphasize that it was just an accident. She said Nora cried loudly, but then quieted down, and she thought the baby was just a little hurt and would be fine. This was the first time Helen had admitted that a collision had occurred, and it created a turning point in the interrogation. However, Pierce immediately realized that this confession was only part of the story. He ordered the technical team to immediately bring in a baby-sized mannequin and the dented toy truck to simulate the scene. In the simulation room, the technician recreated the scenario of an adult picking up a newborn, tripping over the toy truck, and dropping the mannequin onto the wooden floor. Multiple trials showed a drop from an adult's arm height to a flat floor could not produce two parallel skull fractures, as reported in the forensics. The height and force of the fall were completely insufficient. When they tried having the mannequin's head hit the edge of the toy truck, the injury was closer to reality, but still not as severe as in Nora's X-rays. The simulation team's conclusion: the edge of the toy truck could be the instrument of injury, but the impact force would have to be much stronger than a random fall. In other words, Helen's account of the baby accidentally falling did not match forensic science. When Pierce returned to the interrogation, he presented the simulation report for comparison. Helen looked at the images of the skull fractures, her lips pressing tightly together. When Pierce asked, "Are you sure the baby only fell once?" Helen didn't answer right away but lowered her head, murmuring, "I don't remember clearly." Helen's vagueness only added weight to the suspicions in the file. Amid the tense investigation, Pierce's office received a call from Ogden First Ward Church, where Helen had worked as a babysitter for a few months before moving to Provo. A manager there said there had been several verbal complaints from parents about how Helen handled children, too rough when picking them up, impatient when they cried, overreacting when kids spilled things, one case of a child with a bruise after a session. None of the reports became official records, but the church still kept internal notes because something felt off. As Pierce read these notes, he realized they weren't isolated incidents. This was a repeating pattern of behavior over time: impatience with crying, using more force than necessary, and often blaming accidents when things went wrong. This surprisingly linked up with Helen's changing account in Provo. When confronted with the information from Ogden Church, Helen became flustered. She said, "They just misunderstood me, then I didn't mean to hurt anyone," but still couldn't provide a clear explanation for why so many people described the same pattern of behavior. Pierce began to see the structure of the story clearly. Helen confessed to the baby falling, but the simulation showed the force wasn't enough. The edge of the toy truck matched the injury type, but required strong force. Forensic evidence showed severe trauma, inconsistent with an accident. Helen's statements changed with each question, and now there was a history of rough handling of children from her previous job. After hours of interrogation, Helen began to tire and lose her composure. Pierce asked once more if there was anything that happened after the fall that she hadn't mentioned. Helen fell silent, avoiding his gaze, and only repeated that "I didn't mean to." This repetition without additional information or clear affirmation suggested she was trying to hide something. By the end of the day, Pierce compiled his report. Helen admitted part of the truth: there was a collision. The admission didn't match the extent of the injuries. Evidence from Ogden Church pointed to loss of control under stress. The repeating behavioral patterns suggested this wasn't a simple accident. Further investigation needed in the direction of intentional or semi-intentional injury. These notes marked a turning point in the investigation, not because Helen had confessed the full truth, but because what she said, combined with forensic evidence in her past, had opened the door to a larger hypothesis. Nora didn't die from a fall. The baby may have died from a forceful action stemming from stress, frustration, or loss of control, something Helen had been suspected of before. Pierce closed the file, knowing the next interrogation round would have to dig deeper. But this step, the partial confession and clues from the past, was the piece that began to reveal the true shape of the entire case. A few days after Helen's partial confession about tripping over the toy truck and dropping Nora to the floor, the forensics lab sent Detective Alan Pierce a supplemental report. This new result immediately made him sit bolt upright. Tissue samples around Nora's skull fracture contained traces of red metallic paint. Dr. Henry Calloway noted explicitly, this was the type of paint used on metal toys from the late 1970s, perfectly matching the paint layer on the red toy pickup truck found in the bedroom. This indicated that Nora's head had made direct contact with the edge of the truck at the moment of injury. However, he also noted that the paint trace didn't prove who caused the injury. It only confirmed the instrument. To charge someone, the police still needed to link the instrument to intentional behavior. Pierce immediately reviewed the crime scene photos. The toy truck had a deep dent, with paint chipped away to expose gray metal. When placed next to images of Nora's skull, the connection was almost undeniable. But something was still missing, a crucial link motive. That's why Pierce summoned Dorothy Hale to the station for more questions about the morning of the incident. This time Dorothy was no longer evasive. When Pierce asked if she'd heard Helen complain about Nora, Dorothy was silent for a moment, then nodded. She said that when Maggie left the house, Helen had seemed stressed and said Nora had been crying all morning, that she hadn't slept enough, and felt a headache from the crying. At the time, Dorothy thought it was just typical babysitter griping, but after Nora's death, she began recalling it with clear worry. This information immediately connected Pierce to the notes from Ogden First Ward Church, where Helen had babysat. The verbal complaints from parents there were strikingly similar. Helen lost patience when kids cried, handled them roughly, sometimes leaving bruises that she always explained as accidents. Now the picture of a repeating behavioral pattern emerged clearly: impatience with crying, quick to lose control when tired. Previous complaints at the old job. On the morning Nora died, Helen complained in exactly the same way. But even though the behavioral pattern showed a dangerous tendency to prosecute, the police still needed physical evidence directly tying Helen to the injurious act. Pierce ordered the technical team to re-examine the toy truck, but as he predicted, the surface had been wiped clean, with no blood, tissue, or new fingerprints remaining. If Helen had really used it, she had erased all traces in time. This made charging her even harder, even though the prior accident simulation had proven that a random drop couldn't cause Nora's parallel skull fractures and rib breaks. When interrogating Helen again about the red paint, she seemed confused, saying, "Maybe the baby's head hit the truck when I picked her up." But this evasion only convinced Pierce she was dodging an important truth. Still, the legal truth wasn't fully on his side. No witnesses, no video, no new fingerprints on the truck, and Helen's confession was only an accident insufficient to prove intent. When piecing it all together, Pierce hit a wall: instrument of injury, identified. Suspicious circumstances, clear. Motive: impatience, loss of control, present. Past behavioral pattern, present. Direct physical evidence for prosecution, lacking. In the file, he noted at the end of the session, strong leads, but not yet at the threshold of evidence for prosecution. Need to dig deeper into Helen's past and behavior. The case moved closer to answers, but was still held back by the final gap, one that could only be filled by a bigger clue, or a full confession that Helen was still trying to avoid. By early 1980, after nearly half a year of investigation, Detective Alan Pierce was forced to face what he'd always dreaded. The Nora Linton case lacked sufficient evidence to proceed to prosecution. Every clue pointed to Helen Shepherd, but there was no direct physical evidence to charge her. Forensics confirmed the instrument of injury was likely the red toy pickup truck, but the surface had been wiped clean, with no blood or tissue remaining. Helen confessed to the baby falling when she tripped over the toy, but simulations showed the drop force couldn't cause two parallel skull fractures or rib breaks. Dorothy and Doreen's statements conflicted, but no one witnessed violence. The past behavioral pattern from Ogden Church indicated a temper that lost control with kids, but it wasn't enough to hold up in court. It all created a circle of suspicion, not evidence. No witnesses, no cameras, no intact physical proof. In March 1980, the Utah County Prosecutor's Office announced insufficient basis for criminal prosecution. The case was placed in investigation suspended status, meaning open, but with no active investigation. Maggie Linton nearly collapsed. After Nora's funeral, she left Provo for Cedar City to seek peace, but the pain of losing her child followed her forever. Helen left Provo almost immediately. She moved to Logan, then Ogden, far from the town where every eye looked at her with suspicion. Helen's disappearance only fueled public belief that she had something to run from, but under the law, no one could hold her. Dorothy Hale, the only one who might know more, stayed silent. She refused further answers, saying, "I've said everything I remember." Pierce understood. She feared breaking up her own family, but that silence also closed an important door in the case. A year later, in the summer of 1981, Maggie's old house was renovated by new owners. While removing the wooden wall paneling in the hallway, a worker unexpectedly found a red metal toy truck hidden deep inside the wall cavity. It was the most crucial piece of evidence Pierce had always suspected. The truck had a dent matching Nora's head injury. Someone had deliberately stuffed it into the wall to hide it, rather than discard or leave it out. The worker brought the truck to the police station, but the discovery came too late. The surface was further scratched, more paint chipped, and all biological traces gone. Figuring out who hid it was nearly impossible. The house had changed hands multiple times, and the hiding time couldn't be pinpointed. As Pierce looked at the truck under the desk lamp, he felt like someone had just slammed the door on the truth, right in front of him. This had once been the most vital evidence, and now it was completely useless in court. In early 1982, after a final review, the investigations unit officially moved the Nora Linton case to the cold case list. The file was archived, with no active investigation. Pierce kept a copy on his desk for weeks, before reluctantly filing it away. He always felt like he was missing something, a small detail that could have turned the whole case around. But time was no longer on his side. No one was arrested, no full confession, no justice for baby Nora, and the case closed, at least on paper. But in Pierce's heart, it smoldered like a scar that never faded. 31 years have passed since the Nora Linton case became a cold case. Provo has changed, and most of those involved have left the town. Detective Alan Pierce has retired, but Nora's file still sits on the bookshelf in his home office, a case that has never left his mind. In 2010, Pierce received an unexpected call from Pastor Thomas Granger of the Ogden First Ward Church. The pastor's voice was tense. "We are holding a confession related to the 1979 case. The confessor is Dorothy Hale." Dorothy, Helen Shepard's former mother-in-law, was taken to Ogden Regional Medical Center after a severe stroke. In critical condition, she requested to see the pastor to confess her sins and insisted that her confession be forwarded to the police after her death. The church, per protocol, recorded the entire conversation. Dorothy passed away a few hours later. The tape was sealed and stored in the church's safe, awaiting an official representative to retrieve it. Pierce, the man who had pursued Nora's case for years, arrived in Ogden that very afternoon. In the church's small meeting room, Pastor Granger placed an old tape on the table, its faded label reading, "Dorothy Hale, July 2010. Confession." When the tape was played, Dorothy's voice emerged, weak, trembling, but clear in every word. Dorothy admitted that on the morning Nora went missing, she and Doran hadn't been in the yard the whole time as they had claimed. She had heard two loud noises from inside the house, one like something falling, and the second like hitting a hard edge. She called for Helen, but no one answered. When she entered, Dorothy saw Helen holding Nora in a state of panic. The baby's head was tilted to one side, unmoving. Dorothy said, "I saw the toy truck in Helen's hand, and there was red paint on her shirt." Helen said the baby had fallen, but Dorothy didn't believe it. According to her, Helen had burst into tears, saying she didn't know what to do, and was afraid of losing custody if the police found out. Dorothy said on the tape, "I told her not to call the police. I don't know what I was thinking at the time. I just wanted to protect the family." Then she confessed to a detail that sent chills down Pierce's spine. "I was the one who brought the pink blanket and teddy bear to Helen. I stood and watched her dig the hole. I helped wrap Nora up, then we buried her." Dorothy paused for a long moment, the sound of her breathing mixed with the machine's hum in the background of the tape. Then she said the final thing, the one the police had never uncovered in 1979 or 1981. "I hid the toy truck in the wall. I did it so everything would disappear." When the tape ended, no one in the room said a word. Granger closed the box, resealed it, and signed the handover document. The church confirmed that the tape had not been opened or copied from the time of recording until now. Even though Dorothy had passed away, her confession held immense value, admission of helping to bury the body, confirmation of Helen's direct involvement, confirmation that the toy truck was the object that caused the injury, admission of concealing evidence in 1979. The case was no longer scattered suspicions, but a direct account from someone who had been in the house that day. Pierce left the church that evening, the tape in hand. The feeling he carried wasn't victory, but the heavy weight of someone who had waited 3 decades to hear the truth, a truth spoken only when its keeper was preparing to leave the world. Even though Helen Shepherd had long since left Provo and Dorothy had passed away, the tape was the most crucial verbal evidence the case had ever had. It not only answered what happened, but also exposed what Pierce had always sensed. Nora's death was no accident. It had been covered up by the very people in that house. The Nora Linton case, seemingly buried with the years, now had a chance to be reopened, from the deathbed confession of a woman who had carried that secret for over 30 years. In 2024, more than 40 years after Nora Linton's death, and 14 years after Dorothy Hale's deathbed confession, the Utah Cold Case Unit officially reopened the file, for the first time since it was archived. The reason wasn't just the 2010 tape, but an entirely new generation of forensic technology that allowed testing traces that couldn't be examined in 1979. The person assigned to handle the file was none other than Detective Laura Pierce, the daughter of former investigator Alan Pierce. She had grown up watching her father keep an old case on the bookshelf, and now she was the one taking up that unfinished legacy. Laura and her investigative team returned to Maggie Linton's old house, the site where the new owners had agreed to allow resurveying. In the backyard, the area that had once been Nora's burial pit was still there, though it had been leveled multiple times. With ground-penetrating radar, GPR and 3D stratigraphic scanning, they could analyze each layer of soil like opening pages in a diary. When the data appeared on the screen, the tech team discovered something that made the entire unit convene immediately. There were 2 distinct burial soil layers. The upper layer, compacted, uniform, consistent with yard leveling, over many years later. The lower layer, mixed unstructured, with signs of hasty digging, but most strikingly, a secondary soil area to the right, about 3 feet from the main pit, showed signs of being dug again after the initial burial. This indicated, not just one person dug the hole, there had to be a second person involved afterward. Dorothy's confession, "I stood and watched her dig the hole," was now confirmed by science. Dorothy herself had returned to dig, or smooth the soil to conceal the traces. Laura sent the 3D model images back to the Cold Case Unit office for reconstructing the 1979 scene. All signs pointed to the burial being done in haste, without large tools, and involving 2 people at different times, perfectly matching what Dorothy had said on the tape. All the 1979 evidence was pulled from the Utah County Sheriff's storage: the pink blanket caked with dirt, the small teddy bear, and especially the red toy pickup truck, found in 1981. Back then, without technology, no DNA could be found. But 2024 was different. The soil and fiber samples stuck to the blanket were separated, using micro-separation techniques. After multiple filtrations, the lab extracted an extremely small amount of DNA, not enough for old technology analysis, but sufficient for high-sensitivity DNA profiling. The result made the entire lab pause for a few seconds. The DNA on the pink blanket matched Helen Shepherd 99.98%. Not DNA left from previous times she had held Nora. The experts determined the DNA sample was embedded deep in the fibers, with an unusual density, indicating it likely adhered during a stressful situation, or when the object was gripped very tightly, not casual contact. With this evidence, Laura made the first mark in the file: Helen Shepherd had direct contact with the blanket during body handling. The toy truck, the presumed most important injury-causing object, was reanalyzed using Raman spectroscopy and laser scanning. The analyses showed residual red paint, matching the paint traces in Nora's skull tissue, dents on the truck bed, consistent with the parallel skull fracture pattern from the 1979 autopsy report, and micro-sliding marks on the truck's edge surface, matching the model of an infant's head impacting a hard object. For the first time in 45 years, science confirmed the toy truck was the object that caused the trauma. Finally, Laura requested reanalysis of the tiny fiber sample collected from Nora's hair in 1979. Touch DNA analysis yielded results showing a mixed DNA profile, including Dorothy's, matching about 94%. This aligned with Dorothy wrapping the blanket and touching the baby's hair during the burial. When Laura compiled all the data, the preliminary conclusion was clear: Helen's DNA on the blanket. GPR and 3D modeling, proving two people participated in the burial. The toy truck confirmed as the injury-causing object. Touch DNA, showing Dorothy was present during body handling. Dorothy's 2010 tape, perfectly matching the soil model and DNA. What her father had once sensed, that Nora didn't die by accident, now became a legally supported conclusion backed by modern technology. As Laura placed the report on the table, she felt like she was continuing the path Alan Pierce hadn't finished. For the first time in 4 decades, Nora's case was no longer intuition or suspicion. It had a complete body of evidence, enough to reopen the investigation and point straight at the person responsible: Helen Shepherd, the woman who had escaped justice in 1979. And now, thanks to technology, justice wouldn't let that case lie dormant in the files anymore. After the DNA analysis and 3D soil modeling had shown 2 people involved in concealing Nora, Detective Laura Pierce knew she needed one final link: a living witness who could corroborate Dorothy's confession. The only one left was Doreen Parker, now 96 years old, living in a nursing home in Layton. Laura arranged the meeting. She brought with her a copy of Dorothy's 2010 confession tape, DNA results showing Helen had directly handled Nora's body, 3D stratigraphic scan images, proving 2 instances of digging. She didn't know how sharp Doreen's memory still was, but this was the last chance to confirm the full truth. The nursing home was quiet, filled only with the scent of disinfectant and the soft sound of wheelchairs rolling. When Laura entered room 214, Mrs. Doreen sat by the window, hands clasped, eyes clouded with age, but still holding an unusual sharpness. "You're Pierce's daughter?" she asked. Laura nodded. Mrs. Doreen sighed softly. "He asked me about it a long time ago." Laura started gently. "I'd like to ask about the morning it happened in 1979, about little Nora." Mrs. Doreen closed her eyes. When she opened them, her voice was faint but direct. "Dorothy lied, and I let her do it. Doreen recounted that on that morning, she and Dorothy had indeed gone out to the yard, but not for the entire time as they had initially claimed. They heard two loud noises from inside the house. She called for Helen, but no one answered. When they went back inside, she saw Helen holding Nora, the baby's head tilted, motionless. Helen was trembling, sobbing as she said, "She fell, I didn't mean to." But the detail Doreen remembered most clearly, the toy truck was lying next to them, and there was a red streak on Helen's shirt. That was a detail perfectly matching the red paint traces found in Nora's skull tissue. According to Doreen, Dorothy pulled her aside and said, "Don't call the police. She'll lose everything. We have to help her." Dorothy took the initiative to fetch the pink blanket and teddy bear, then handed Helen a small shovel. Doreen stood by as Helen dug the hole. Dorothy oversaw the whole thing, and later smoothed the soil to cover the traces. When Laura asked, "Did you see Dorothy directly touch the body?" Doreen replied, "Yes." She rewrapped the blanket and placed the baby in the hole. "I'll never forget it." Laura pulled out a tablet and played an excerpt from Dorothy's confession tape, the account of helping with the burial, hiding the toy truck in the wall, and protecting Helen at all costs. Doreen listened, nodding slowly. "Yes, she did all of that. I remember her saying, 'This is the only way to save her.'" When viewing the 3D scan images of the two soil layers, Doreen began to cry. Yes, that was Dorothy. She went back and dug more. "I saw it, but I stayed silent for decades." After calming down, Doreen said the one thing Laura needed most to solidify the file: Helen hit the baby. "I didn't see the blow, but I knew. When I entered the house, Helen's face was ashen. The toy truck wasn't in its usual spot, and Dorothy understood right away the baby was hit because she cried too much." That statement matched Dorothy's confession that Helen couldn't stand the baby's crying. The Ogden Church notes on Helen's temper, the time of death aligning with when Helen was alone, Helen's DNA deeply embedded in the pink blanket. Doreen ended with, "Dorothy covered it up. Helen caused it all. I just saw the aftermath." As Laura left the nursing home, she finalized the report. Doreen confirmed Dorothy's participation in concealing the body. Doreen confirmed Dorothy hid the evidence, the toy truck. Doreen affirmed Helen was the one who caused the initial injury. The 2010 tape perfectly matched Doreen's account. Based on the final witness statement, along with the DNA and soil model evidence, the Utah Cold Case Unit officially concluded Dorothy Hale, accomplice in concealing the crime, now deceased. The case still had one person directly responsible, Helen Shepherd, who had lived 45 years outside the law, and now nothing from the past could shield her anymore. After collecting sufficient DNA evidence, 3D soil models, and the final testimony from Doreen Parker, the Utah Cold Case Unit moved on to the most critical investigative step: reconstructing the 1979 mechanism of death using modern forensic technology. Biomechanical trauma expert Evan Holt was invited to participate, renowned for his collision simulations using lidar and 4D volumetric sensors. Holt and his team went to Maggie Linton's old house, scanning the entire bedroom with lidar and accurately reconstructing the position of every item: the crib, the bed, where the toy car once lay, the average height of Helen, while holding Nora, the distance from the bed to the floor. The first simulation results, based on Helen's statement that she tripped over the toy car and dropped Nora, showed that the impact force from that height was completely insufficient to cause two parallel skull fractures or rib breaks. No natural fall scenario could recreate the severe injuries Nora sustained. Next, Holt simulated the possibility of Nora's head being slammed into the edge of the metal toy truck bed, which had sharp edges matching the red paint streak found in the skull tissue. When simulating a strong impact force in a horizontal or downward direction, the exact type that occurs when an adult loses control in the face of a child's crying, the screen displayed results that matched almost perfectly with the 1979 X-rays: two parallel skull fractures, the injury area, and force levels consistent with immediate fatal trauma. Holt's report concluded, Nora Linton died on the spot from a strong impact against a hard-edged object, and the injury-causing item matched 100% with the red toy pickup truck. Subsequently, the forensic team reanalyzed the 3D scan stratigraphy in the backyard, discovering that the burial pit had two phases of digging. The first layer of soil was roughly disturbed and messy, consistent with Dorothy's description of Helen digging the hole in panic. The second layer was flat and lightly compacted, indicating that someone else, Dorothy herself, had returned to conceal it more thoroughly. Every detail matched perfectly with the 2010 confession tape and Doreen's account. Helen caused the injury. Dorothy helped bury the body and hide the evidence. When compiling everything, Helen's DNA on the pink blanket, the red paint streak in the skull tissue, the lidar collision model, stratigraphic data, Dorothy's deathbed confession, and Doreen's confirmation, Laura Pierce understood that the chain of evidence was complete. She closed the report folder and sent it to the Utah prosecutor's office, requesting approval for an arrest warrant for Helen Shepherd on first-degree murder charges, while identifying Dorothy Hale as a deceased accomplice. After more than 40 years, the prosecutor looked at Laura and said only one sentence, "This file is strong enough, proceed with the arrest warrant." The Nora Linton case finally entered the chapter it should have had since 1979. The chapter of justice for a 2-month-old child. In May 2025, after the Utah prosecutor's office approved the arrest warrant based on the entire new chain of evidence, from DNA, lidar simulations, 3D stratigraphy, Dorothy Hale's confession, and Doreen Parker's final testimony, the Utah Cold Case Unit officially launched the operation to apprehend Helen Shepherd, who had evaded responsibility for over 40 years. For decades, Helen had lived quietly, changing addresses frequently, keeping her personal records minimal, avoiding social media, and not participating in community activities. But Laura Pierce and the investigative team traced financial trails, medical records, and small changes in tax information to determine that Helen had moved to Boise, Idaho, where she lived in a small rented house in a quiet residential area outside the city. On May 12, 2025, at 7 a.m., the federal arrest team and Utah police coordinated with Boise police to set up a perimeter around the neighborhood. Helen lived alone, with no children nearby, and no records indicating she still had contact with her former husband's family. When the task force knocked on the door, Helen stepped out, her hair gray, her back slightly hunched, but her eyes immediately recognizing the situation. Before the police could finish reading the arrest warrant, she said something that silenced the entire team for a few seconds. "I knew this day would come." No resistance, no questions about the reason, no immediate demand for a lawyer. Helen extended her hands forward, waiting for the handcuffs to snap around her wrists. As she was led to the car, she asked only one thing: was it Dorothy who finally spoke up? Laura stood a few steps away, the first time she faced the woman her father had pursued for nearly half his life. She replied, "She confessed before she died, and she didn't lie." Helen bowed her head, her lips trembling, but she didn't react violently. She only whispered, "I should have spoken up from the beginning." At the Boise police station interrogation room, Helen was fully informed of her rights and offered a lawyer, but she refused, saying she wanted to tell the truth without further delay. Laura, who had been closely following the case for 2 years, personally conducted the interrogation. Helen began speaking in a hoarse voice, as if the words had been stuck in her throat for decades. "That day, Nora cried a lot. I was tired, I hadn't slept, I couldn't take it." Helen didn't call it a hit, but Laura didn't need to hear that word. Helen just said, "I shook her hard, then I got so frustrated. I slammed the baby's head against the edge of the truck. It all happened in a few seconds. I didn't think. I just wanted her to stop." Each word precisely matched what the forensic simulations had proven. Helen recounted that baby Nora stopped crying immediately. She panicked. When Dorothy entered the room, she read everything with just one look. Dorothy told Helen not to call the police, not to run, not to do anything except let her handle it. Helen confessed. Dorothy said that if I got caught, the family would be destroyed. She told me to bury the baby in the backyard. I followed her. I wasn't clear-headed enough to argue. Regarding the toy truck hidden in the wall, Helen insisted she didn't know Dorothy had done that. She told me not to worry. She would clean it up. I didn't know where she hid it. When Laura asked why she hadn't confessed for 40 years, Helen was silent for a very long time. Finally, she said, "I was afraid. Afraid of everything being turned upside down. Afraid of being hated. Afraid of being seen as a child killer. But I was also afraid of myself." News of Helen Shepherd's arrest was announced that same afternoon. Within hours, it spread across Utah and Idaho, then quickly hit the headlines of major newspapers. Cold Case 1979, solved. Babysitter arrested in Boise. Utah infant murder case reopened after 45 years. Provo, the place once haunted by Nora's death, was stunned. Residents from the 1979 neighborhood, those who had searched for Nora in the heat, the handyman who found the truck in the wall in 1981, Maggie's old neighbors, all spoke out. Many wrote, "I can't believe Helen lived free for so long. Justice for baby Nora has finally come." Dorothy took this secret to her grave, but at least now the truth has been told. The Ogden First Ward Church, where complaints about Helen had once been made, also issued an official statement acknowledging that they had suspected her behavior, but couldn't act without an official report. 2 days later, Helen was transported by specialized vehicle back to Salt Lake City, where the Utah Cold Case Unit and the prosecutor's office prepared for the official announcement. As she stepped out of the car in front of a swarm of reporters, Helen said only one sentence, "I am guilty. I apologize to baby Nora's family." No one knew if that apology truly came from remorse or just from the collapse when all secrets were exposed. But for Laura, the answer no longer mattered. Justice had finally arrived. Helen Shepherd was held at Utah State Correctional Facility, awaiting trial. After 46 years, the name Nora Linton, the 2-month-old girl who vanished from a home in Provo, finally appeared in the story she should have had all along. The story of justice. News of Helen Shepherd's arrest, after 46 years, spread across Utah in just a few hours, plunging Provo, the town that had tried to forget baby Nora Linton's mysterious death, immediately into a state of shock. Local television replayed footage of Helen in handcuffs, stepping out of her rented house in Boise. Major newspapers covered it relentlessly. People who had lived in the 1979 neighborhood called each other to recount memories they thought they'd buried deep. For many it was like a moment when time rewound to where the tragedy had been stuck for decades. Immediately, the Provo community split into two opposing opinions. One group argued that Nora's death was an accident, in a moment of losing control, an impulsive act by a young woman exhausted by crying and the pressure of childcare. They recalled Helen's words upon arrest, "I knew this day would come," as evidence that she had carried guilt her whole life. Some said Helen hadn't committed any further crimes in 46 years, living quietly and harming no one, and therefore her circumstances at the time needed consideration, especially since caring for a newborn is a highly stressful task for a young person without support. But the other side, larger and more vehement, insisted this was clearly a crime. They cited the entire new evidence, lidar simulations proving the impact force couldn't be from a natural fall, Helen's DNA embedded deep in the pink blanket fibers, 3D stratigraphy showing 2 phases of digging the hole, Dorothy Hale's 2010 confession, and especially the detail of Dorothy hiding the toy truck in the wall. "No one buries a child because of an accident," an elderly resident wrote on the Provo forum. "And no one just happens to hide an injury-causing object in a wall." For them, Helen's silence for 4 decades, and letting Nora's birth mother live in agony, was what enraged the public the most. The arrest quickly extended beyond Utah's borders. National TV networks ran breaking news tickers, "Utah 1979, cold case solved." Crime analysis shows and true crime podcasts immediately exploited the story. Many legal experts called it a textbook example of how modern science, from lidar scanning to high-sensitivity DNA analysis, can overturn a case thought to be buried forever. Some psychologists discussed the possibility of Helen having impulse control disorder or caregiver burnout, but most agreed that her subsequent cover-up behavior, burying the body, destroying evidence, coordinating with Dorothy, showed clear awareness of guilt. Right in Provo, those who lived through the 1979 disappearance began sharing their memories again. Some recounted searching for Nora with flashlights all night. Others remembered police digging up the shallow hole behind the house. Still others recalled the moment the handyman found the toy truck in the wall, in 1981. Those stories were posted on social media, creating an unprecedented wave of discussion. The name Maggie Linton, Nora's mother, was also mentioned widely. Though she refused interviews, neighbors said that upon hearing of Helen's arrest, she just burst into tears and said, "Finally, she's been given back her voice." That quote spread across the internet, becoming a symbol of the patience and enduring pain the mother had carried for 4 decades. From a case once seen as Provo's sad mystery, the Nora Linton story now became a national topic, not just because of a child's tragedy, but because it exposed the power of justice when combined with modern science. Provo, after years of silence, finally had to confront the old story again, this time not as an unanswered rumor, but as a reminder that the truth always waits to be found. The trial of Helen Shepherd officially opened at the 3rd District Court, Salt Lake City, in March 2026. Even though more than 4 decades had passed since Nora Linton's death, the courtroom was still packed. Provo residents who participated in the 1979 search, the victim's family, national press, and even those who followed the case since it was reopened in 2024. The atmosphere in the room was like an intersection between the past and present, a trial that not only judged a defendant, but also judged a secret that Utah had carried for nearly half a century. Helen entered the courtroom with a thin figure, hair almost entirely gray, but her face still held the stubbornness that made investigators in 1979 suspicious. She didn't look around, didn't seek anyone's eyes. She just sat down in the defendant's chair, hands clasped, and waited. Chief Prosecutor Marilyn Cortez opened with the statement, "Time can bury many things, but science cannot." She methodically presented all the evidence, 3D geological model proving 2 instances of digging, a hole by Helen, one by Dorothy. Lidar collision simulation reconstructing the impact force causing 2 parallel skull fractures, matching the edge of the metal toy car. High-sensitivity DNA, found deep in the pink blanket fibers, matching Helen, placing her at the scene of handling the body. Touch DNA found in Nora's hair, matching Dorothy, aligning with the 2010 confession. Dorothy Hale's tape, where she confessed to helping bury the body, hiding evidence, and witnessing the consequences of Helen's actions. Doreen Parker's testimony, the final witness confirming the entire sequence of events on that morning in 1979. On the large screen was the lidar simulation, Nora reconstructed in 3D form, next to the red toy car, movement trajectory, impact point. No one in the room could maintain composure before that simulated scene. Cortez stated clearly, it wasn't a fall, it wasn't a trip, this was a direct impact, created by an adult out of control. Helen's defense attorney Jeffrey Moore did not deny that Helen caused the injury, but repeatedly emphasized Helen was only 26 years old at the time. She was exhausted from caring for young children and part-time work. She suffered from undiagnosed postpartum anxiety disorder. No one directly witnessed the act. The burial and hiding of evidence was directed by Dorothy, while Helen was completely stunned and dependent at the time. Moore argued that Helen's actions stemmed from panic rather than intent to kill. This isn't a planned murderer. This is a young mother pushed to the limits of her psyche. He urged the jury to consider lesser charges, manslaughter, or involuntary manslaughter. When allowed to stand, Helen bowed her head for a long time. Her voice was soft but clear, I dare not say I'm innocent. I dare not say it was entirely an accident. I hurt the baby, I did wrong, and I let Dorothy cover everything up, because I was too weak to confess myself. I'm sorry. When the prosecutor asked, "Did you intentionally smash Nora's head into the toy car?" Helen was silent to the point that the courtroom could hear the tape recorder running. Finally she answered, "I don't know if it was intentional, I just know I lost control of myself." That answer caused division. Some saw remorse, others heard evasion. The prosecution concluded with a firm statement: a 2-month-old child cannot protect herself. Her justice cannot be delayed any longer. The defense emphasized, Helen is not a monster, she is a person who made a mistake in a brief moment. The jury left for deliberation in silence. The discussion lasted nearly 8 hours, an unusually long time for a case with abundant scientific evidence, but understandable because they were facing a case dusted for too long and laden with layers of emotion. At the end of the day, the jury entered. Helen stood up, hands trembling slightly but no longer clasped tightly. The court declared, Helen Shepherd guilty of second-degree murder, sentence life imprisonment, with possibility of parole after 25 years. A few people in the room burst into tears, others sighed in relief. Maggie Linton did not appear in court, but her representative said she finally feels Nora has been heard. Helen bowed her head, crying uncontrollably for the first time during the entire trial. She was led out amid whispers, camera clicks, and the gazes of those who had waited nearly half a century to witness this moment. The trial closed, but the Nora Linton case, the 2-month-old child robbed of a chance at life, finally had a clear ending, no longer buried under the 1979 backyard soil. 2 weeks after the verdict was pronounced in Salt Lake City, Detective Laura Pierce drove to Cedar City, the peaceful town where Maggie Linton, Nora's mother, had lived for 4 decades. Now 70 years old, with snow-white hair, she lived in a small house next to a pine-shaded road. Laura knew this meeting wasn't procedure, not a job duty. It was what her father, Alan Pierce, had wanted since 1979, but never had the chance to do: bring the truth back to Nora's family. Maggie opened the door when Laura knocked lightly. She stood there, hair tied neatly, posture still straight, but her eyes held a lifetime of endurance. When Laura introduced herself, Maggie gave a small, gentle but weary smile. Your father came here a lifetime ago. They sat in the small living room, where the only photo hung was of Nora, a 2-month-old girl, round eyes wide open, taken just a week before she went missing. Maggie placed the frame on the table between them, as if wanting the baby to be present in the conversation. Laura recounted the trial proceedings, the verdict, and the moment Helen broke down crying upon hearing the sentence. Maggie listened without interrupting. Only when Laura said, "Justice has been served, ma'am," did Maggie grasp Laura's hand tightly and choke up. Not, justice came too late, but the truth never lost. Maggie confessed that in the early years, she was angry with herself. Angry for leaving her child with someone else to watch. Angry for not being there to save Nora. Angry that no one believed her intuition that the death wasn't an accident. When the case was shelved in 1980, she was nearly despairing. I thought the whole world had turned its back. I thought she would be forgotten. But Dorothy's 2010 tape, though Maggie didn't watch it directly, sparked a small hope in her. She remembered vividly the day she received the call from police, saying the file was reopened in 2024. I cried all afternoon, she said. I knew I was about to hear something painful, but I also knew it would be the truth. When Laura handed over a copy of the final report, kept permanently in the records, Maggie placed her hand on the paper, as if it were proof of an apology. Nora never heard. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who didn't give up. The atmosphere in the room grew quiet as Maggie recounted the years after the loss. She never had more children, not because she couldn't, but because she no longer had enough heart to lose another. Still she lived quietly, going to church, volunteering, trying to get through each day without letting the pain consume her. Nora only lived 2 months on this earth, but her pain has lived in me for 46 years. When Laura asked how she felt after the verdict, Maggie took a long time to answer, lighter. Not because Helen is in prison, but because finally I know what happened to my child. The greatest loss is not knowing the truth. When the truth has a name, the pain has a place to rest. Maggie never remarried, but she had an extended family, siblings, nieces, nephews, all grown up hearing Nora's story as a reminder of children's fragility and the importance of truth. When Helen was arrested, the whole family gathered at the Cedar City Church. One of Maggie's nieces said, "Auntie, finally Nora has come back to us." That statement made Maggie cry like it was the first time in years. But those were tears of peace. When Laura stood to say goodbye, Maggie held her hand tightly. "Your father never forgot her. Neither did you. You both did what I once thought would never happen." Laura stepped outside as the afternoon sun cast over the distant red mountains. She felt what her father once said, "There are cases that never leave the investigator's heart." And Nora Linton was such a case of persistence, enduring pain, but also of hope. At the end of the small road, Laura stopped and looked back at Maggie's house, where pain had existed for nearly half a century, but now finally pieced together by truth. Little Nora only lived 2 months, but thanks to that verdict, this meeting, and the people who didn't give up, her story finally had an ending that could bring comfort to the one who loved her most. 1 month after the meeting between Detective Laura Pierce and Maggie Linton, the Utah Department of Justice and the Utah Cold Case Unit held a joint press conference in Salt Lake City to announce the final results of the case. That day the sky was clear, sunlight streaming through the large glass windows of the building headquarters, like a symbolic sign of transparency. The thing, the Nora Linton case, had waited for nearly half a century. In the press room, investigators, prosecutors, forensic experts, and even those who participated in the case reconstruction, stood in a long row. On the right side, Laura held the file labeled #79PR214, the case number for Nora, opened in July 1979, and now closed forever. Utah, Idaho media, and national newspapers were all present. The case had become one of the most followed stories in the West over the past year. The state attorney general opened with a shocking statement. "Today we officially announce case #79PR214. The death of Nora Linton has been fully resolved. This is the longest-running case solved in Utah state history." As he spoke, the press room space was almost pin-drop silent. The numbers were announced one by one. 46 years of investigation, over 100 personnel involved, 3 generations of investigators, evidence lost for 32 years, 2024 forensic technology was the key to unlocking all knots. On the screen behind, the case timeline appeared from black and white images of 1979 to modern lidar simulations of 2024. When it was Laura's turn to speak, she opened the file, flipping to the last page, where the stamp closed 2026 was in red ink. She said, "Today, we officially archive file #79PR214 into the Utah State Historical Cold Case System. This file will be preserved intact forever, to honor the victim, the family, and those who fought to bring the truth back." A reporter asked, "What made this case solvable after 46 years?" Laura replied, "The people who didn't give up. My father, Detective Alan Pierce, was one of them. The forensic experts were part, technology was part, but the biggest part was Nora's family's persistence." Her voice caught a bit, but her eyes were as resolute as ever since the day she decided to reopen the file. Just hours after the press conference, all major TV networks, CNN, Fox, ABC, CBS, aired special reports. Utah, 1979, cold case solved after 46 years, longest resolution in state history. The reports described how 3D geological scanning, high-sensitivity DNA analysis, and lidar simulations reconstructed every centimeter of the truth. Some late-night TV shows even dedicated segments to discussing the case's impact on forensic reforms and handling crimes against infants. Across Utah, People followed the case like a shared memory. Those who held flashlights searching for Nora in the 1979 night told reporters they finally got their sleep back. The construction worker who found the toy car in the wall in 1981 said he never forgot that moment, and now he felt like he had repaid a debt to himself. When reporters asked Maggie Linton how she felt after the case was officially closed, she simply answered, "The truth doesn't make the pain disappear, but it allows me to live on." In her Cedar City yard, an old pine tree she planted to remember her daughter now had a small wooden plaque added, "Nora Linton, 1979, always remembered." Unpretentious, unsentimental, just a marker to remind that a 2-month-old child deserves justice like anyone. After the verdict, Helen was transferred to Utah State Correctional Facility. She lives in the low-risk female inmate area, no disciplinary violations. Dorothy's family refused to comment to the press. Doreen Parker passed away a few months before the trial, but her testimony became one of the decisive parts of the case. Questions about Helen's motives, exhaustion, psychological pressure or impatience, continue to be analyzed by experts on TV. But all agree on one thing: the verdict brought the right to know the truth back to Nora's family and the Utah community. When the cameras turned off, the press room gradually emptied, and file #79 PR 214 was placed in the official storage vault. Laura stood alone in the large room. She looked at the file, the last page, the final red stamp, and thought of her father, of those who searched for Nora in the dark night, of Maggie and her trembling hands, placing on her daughter's photo. Justice didn't come on time, it didn't save Nora, it didn't erase 46 years of pain. But it came, and sometimes, that's enough for a community to move forward, for a mother to breathe easier, and for the memory of a 2-month-old child to be placed in its rightful place, where the truth is finally named. The story of Nora Linton is not just a criminal case, but a clear mirror for American life today, where we still leave children with babysitters, rely on churches, communities, and sometimes overlook red flags, because we think it's probably fine. In the story, Maggie entrusted her child to Helen, a babysitter introduced through the church group, sounding very safe, with young children, seemingly gentle. But before that, Helen had been complained about by parents in Ogden for minor abuse. The church had internal notes, but no one pushed the issue further. This is a direct lesson for American families. Don't take small complaints lightly. Check backgrounds, ask for thorough references, and trust your gut when something feels off about how someone treats children. The story also reminds us of the moral responsibility when witnessing wrongdoing. Dorothy chose to cover up, help bury the body, hide the toy car in the wall, and carried that secret to her deathbed in 2010. Her silence not only destroyed justice for Nora, but weighed heavily on her and Doreen for decades. In today's American life, with mandatory reporting laws for suspected child abuse in most states, this story reminds that not speaking up is also a form of complicity in crime. Finally, Alan and Laura Pierce's journey shows that combining science, DNA, 3D scanning, lidar, and human persistence can pull justice from the past back. The lesson is: take child protection seriously from small details, dare to speak out when seeing wrong, and believe that truth, however late, is worth pursuing to the end. Thank you for following the journey to reclaim justice for little Nora, over nearly half a century. If you want to continue following cold cases unlocked by truth and technology, remember to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video, where we continue exploring cases thought sunk into oblivion, but still waiting for answers.